Today is the day. Almost 2 years of preparation for this mission. A lot of laughs along with the failures, of course. We knew this day would come. But geez, did it ever sneak up on us. There are 5 of us set to this mission. We will be gone for 6 months. An expedition, scientific research. We loaded everything up earlier this morning. Our clothes and food had been packed for days. I am close with one of my crewmates, Purple. The others trained elsewhere. I have no hard time making friends, so I'm not really worried about that, so long as they keep up with their end of the work. After a long day of goodbyes, double-checking our supply list and going over our mission details one last time, we begin liftoff. We strap in and get ready for takeoff. 3, a deep breath. 2, deep breath. 1 last deep breath. Blast off. I feel the thrust as we begin to lift. I look around to my crew. All 5 of us simultaneously let out a sigh of relief. The first 2 days took a bit of adjusting. It's weird being in space. It's weird not being grounded. I haven't seen much of my crew, although we probably could have done a better job at introducing ourselves. Maybe tomorrow. It's been 4 days and nothing crazy has happened, although I thought that there would only be 5 of us. Last I checked, there were 6. I asked Purple about it, but he can't remember how many of us were actually assigned to this mission. I guess it's not that big of a deal. In case space is actually making me crazy, the astronauts on board are named Cyan, Purple, Red, White, Brown, and then there's me, of course, Black. Today, I'm going to document everything. I'm growing suspicious. Something is not right here. I am starting my day in cafeteria. It is the middle of the ship and by far the biggest room. There are 5 faded blue circular tables in cafeteria. Gross. Someone had left out a day-old pizza on the upper right-hand table. The whole crew starts here every morning. To our right is upper engine. To the left, weapons. My first task of the day is to swipe my card. That's an admin, which is forward and then to the right. I hurry to admin, while Cyan and Purple head right. Red and White head left and Brown stays in cafeteria. Admin is a tiny room. There are 3 desks with widgets at each one. In the middle of the room is the admin table, a layout of the ship with markers as to show the location of other crewmates on the ship. It is also the room where we regulate the ship's O2. I hurry to the end of the room and I swipe my card. An easy start to the day. My next task is in navigation. I'm to check the wiring and fix if needed. Navigation is the head of the ship. There are 2 ways to get there. Back to cafeteria or down to storage. I pick the storage route as priming shields is another one of my tasks. We aren't supposed to do tasks out of order, but since no one is around, I don't think it's too big of a deal so long as they all get done. I head to storage and then right, passing communications. The static from the radio buzzes as I grow closer and then fades as I leave. At the end of the hallway is shields. I begin to prime the shields and see Brown pass by quickly. Hey Brown, how are the tasks going? He mumbles something incoherently and keeps on his way. Rude, but nothing out of the ordinary from what I've noticed the past couple of days. Check. Another task finished. I head up and then left to navigation. In the hallway before reaching navigation, there is a little box with a lightning bolt on it. I quickly unscrew the panel and begin to fix the wires. Blue to blue, red to red, and so on. The next wiring panels and electrical. I decide to pass by cafeteria. On the way in, I download some data. Another one of my tasks. It is in the next room, weapons. The room to the left of cafeteria that I see it. White. His suit ripped in half. His upper half gone. A pool of blood where his stomach and head should be. I'm frozen in fear for a second and then grab my walkie and shakily report. Static. Black reporting. White. He's dead. All answer back hectically, cutting each other off like, where? What? How? We all meet up in cafeteria. Weapons room, I answer. I was alone. I haven't seen anyone except Brown. Brown interrupts and a jumble of words come out. I would never. I could never do something like this. This is inhuman. Red interjects. What are you trying to say, Brown? There is something among us. We all stare at each other in fear, suspicion growing. What do we do? Cyan asks. The fear in her voice unintentionally present. Now that we're all here, I can only remember 5 boarding passes. Why are there 6 of us? She demands. We need to take a vote. I can't recall who wasn't supposed to be here. I thought so too, Cyan. I assure her. I tried to ask Purple, but he couldn't remember. How would I know? Purple interjects. I'm not the boarding pass inspector. A snappy response, but we all are uncomfortable and wary of each other at this point. One of our colleagues had just died. No, he had just been murdered. I didn't know who to trust at this moment. Let's just finish our tasks and get out of here. We can set course back to home once tasks are complete. But the mission... Brown scrambles out. Our mission is over, Brown, I say. We need to finish our tasks and head home. We decide to skip voting anyone without further information. We break away from cafeteria. I hurry down to storage and then left to electrical. I didn't see which way the others went. In all of the commotion, I forgot to look. What could have done that to White? The way the body was cut in half. Only an animal could do that, and where was the upper half? Stop, I can't keep thinking of it, picturing it. I see the little electrical panel and quickly unscrew it. The wires in this box are cut, like the first one. I patch them and close the box. Shoot, in all the commotion, I forgot to do my task in cafeteria. I head back up to cafeteria to download important data. Might as well report what we found in the week since launch. The signal often cuts out, so while I do this task, I unfortunately cannot leave. It's a couple second wait, but it feels like minutes. At 86% completion, the walkie cackles. It's red. Purple is dead. No one responds right away. A simultaneous silence as what we all feared is brought into existence. There really is something here, and it's killing us one by one. Meet me in cafeteria, Red struggles to say. You can hear the pain in his voice. Where? Cyan demands. Lower engine, Red answers. I don't want to randomly throw names, but I saw Brown following Purple earlier. They were together. Lies, Brown mumbles. He's lying. He looks to the rest of us, his helmet black and opaque. I cannot see his face, just like he cannot see mine. I can only hear his voice, but I am unsure if it is a voice that I can trust. He has to go, Cyan bursts out. If you saw Brown, then the imposter is him. We have to vote him out. Calm down, Cyan. I tried to calm her, but she wasn't thinking straight anymore. Vote him out! Vote him out! Vote him out! She screams. I'm not sure what to say. A vote, Red also demands. Okay. One by one we vote. Cyan and Red vote Brown. Brown votes Red. I vote to skip. Brown it is. Cyan rejoices. Red and Cyan throw Brown into the airlock and thrust him into space. I cannot speak. I can't believe this is happening. That this has happened. Cyan and Red turn back towards me. Cyan's helmet is also darkened. I cannot see her expression, but I can imagine it is one of relief. I look at Red, ashamed of what had happened. But his helmet, it isn't black. It's cracked. A long spiderweb of tongues comes shooting out. Both his hands detach and rip Cyan apart in front of me. I try to run, but it's fast. It inhales the top of Cyan's body and runs even faster. In seconds, it's on me. The spiderweb of tongues snap together into one sharp needle. It pierces my head, and its detached arms come at me from both sides. Swiftly, I am ripped into and digested the same as my other colleagues. Everything goes black. You might not notice, but the lights have been acting strange lately. Every time I try to flip them off, they just won't go off. It doesn't affect the electric bill, nothing. It's just strange. Anyways, my name is Jerry, and there has been this global phenomenon to where every hour lights go on and off. It happens probably 50 times a day, which means that over 50 people go missing each day. I have no clue how it's happening, but it just is. I have no idea if I'm next or not. I probably am. But it all started in November 2019. I was on a call with my mom saying that I was moved into my new apartment, but all of a sudden the lights flickered off. Weird, the lights are off, I said. Yeah, they are. It seems to be happening everywhere. My mom responded. What do you mean it's happening everywhere? I asked in a worried tone. It's nothing. Just make sure that you're safe at home. My mom abruptly stopped. Mom? I asked. Answer me. Mom, are you okay? I ended the call and I tried calling back. It went to voicemail. I don't know what happened to her, but I fear the worst has to come. I called my dad. Hey Dad, can you check on Mom? I asked. Sure, what's wrong, son? He responded with a questioning tone. Oh, well, I was on a call with her until she abruptly stopped. I have no clue what happened. I fear that something bad has happened to her, I told him. Yeah, sure, I'll check up on her. Make sure to lock your doors and windows. I don't want anything happening to you, he said to me as he ended the call. It's been a few hours since I have seen her talk to my dad. I hope that he has found my mother or that he is safe. I don't want to lose him. It's been a few months. Law enforcement cannot explain what is happening. The government seems to just be telling lies. The news is telling everyone to lock their doors and windows. I was watching the news right as I saw my dog, Joseph. He looked worried, with his tail going under his stomach. Something was not right. The lights flickered and then Joseph was gone. I don't know how to explain it, but he was just gone. I called his name over and over and even whistled, to which he would have responded with a bark. I now know what is causing it. The lights. It seems every time the light flickers, someone or something disappears. I don't know where they go, but they just disappear. I'll keep y'all updated. I need to check with my family. It's not the lights. It's something that is in the darkness. It comes out once the lights get turned off, and it takes someone or something with it. To where? I have no clue. How? I haven't figured it out yet. It is still unknown. I will start researching about it. Until then, please be safe. Hey guys, it's been a few hours since I've last updated. Anyways, research seems to help quite a bit. The government is telling the truth. They're saying it was a biological test subject that escaped containment, and it seems that he takes people or animals every time the lights go off. They said you need to have a flashlight to keep yourself from becoming a victim. I do have a flashlight, but I do not know what will happen if my flashlight loses battery. I screwed up. I was making dinner from the microwave with my flashlight on the counter. That was until I accidentally knocked it off of the counter to where it broke. It won't turn on. It's broke. It was my good flashlight. Now I have to resolve to the flashlight that is barely bright when turned on. I am next. I knew it would happen, I just could sense it. I'm being watched. Not by someone, but something. Whatever you do not turn your flashlight off. It isn't worth it. My flashlight is flickering. It is running out of battery. This is farewell. You sure you have all the rules memorized? My boss said as he gathered his belongings to go home. Yeah, sure thing. I got them all up here, I said as I pointed to my head. He gave me a nod and he headed out the door of the small office to go home. My boss was a little off to say the least. This was my first month as a security guard at a cemetery right around the corner from my residence, and I had just gotten out of college about 3 months ago. The last month of shifts had been boring, sitting around checking cameras and doing rounds through the cemetery making sure nothing was out of order. Exciting, right? I needed a source of income, and this was the best paying job that I could find. No real experience needed, the flyer said. My take was that they were desperate to find someone fast, so I took advantage of that. I was hired the day that I found the flyer over the phone. I never even found out the guy's name. Once I came in on my first day, my boss gave me no training, no do's and don'ts. Just a verbal list of 10 rules that I had to follow and memorize before Halloween night. These rules are to be followed only on Halloween night, he said. You must follow these rules to the exact way they are told to you. If you mess up even a small part, well, you won't mess up, because I trust you to follow them word for word. I looked at him, confused because this sounded almost like a threat. Nevertheless, I pulled out my phone and started an audio recording so he could record the list. Once he had finished telling me the rules, I was in absolute disbelief. This guy is insane. No wonder why nobody wants to work here. This guy is actually insane, I thought to myself. I know every place has certain rules to follow, but to designate a set of rules, insane rules for Halloween night only, I guess you won't know how I felt until I tell you the rules that he gave me, word for word, exactly how he told me straight from the recording. Rule number 1. On Halloween night, please arrive at 8:30 p.m. No earlier, no later. Do not walk in these doors until it reaches 8:30. For the love of God, please. Rule number 2. Stay inside the office until 9:15. Do not leave, keep yourself occupied, but do not check these security cameras during this time. I'll make sure to turn them off before you get there, so there is no temptation to peek at them. This might be one of the most important rules. If the monitor turns on by itself, do not look either. If for some reason you do look, and you see it has revealed the A section of the cemetery, you must turn off the lights of the office and hide. If it reveals the B or C section and you look at it, your only option is to run. Good luck with this. To make this easier, just cover the monitor with a jacket or a blanket, because you will not want to see what happens out there this time on Halloween night. Rule number 3. After 9:15 strikes, you will have 30 seconds to get out of the office. Leave the door unlocked. It is possible that you will pass an unnaturally tall figure with no facial features. This is not a Halloween costume, and you must tell him good evening and look him right where his eyes would be. If he doesn't respond, continue on your way to patrol the cemetery. If he says anything at all, you must stand completely still. Do not move a muscle. He might walk around you, but if you keep still until he's done, he should walk away with no problem. Go into the office and slam the door behind him. Rule number 4. You will make your way to Section A. Once you inspect Section A, you will realize the gravestone titled, James R. Hackney is being dug up completely. This is not out of the ordinary. Do not, and I mean do not pay any attention to what is inside the 6-foot hole in the ground. You will not see the rest of your shift if you look down in that hole. Just keep walking to Section B and do not look back. Rule number 5. As soon as you cross the bridge from Section A to B, you will notice about a dozen shadow-like figures standing around in a circle around the big oak tree to the left of the bridge. Please listen closely to what I'm about to say. You must find the figure wearing the black top hat. You will walk up behind him and ask, "Am I clear?" If you hear a voice from inside your head say, "Continue," then you carry on to Section B. If you don't hear anything, you must wait. You can look over to this section at this time, but I recommend keeping your eyes down. Trust me. There will be no physical harm to you if you look, but I can't promise you will be emotionally intact after looking. Rule number 6. Once you get the go-ahead, continue on to Section B. You may walk around and do what you would normally do every night here. The only catch is you must stay in this section until 10 p.m. It should be 9:30 to 9:45 by now, so you won't have to wait too long. After the time crosses 10, continue on. Rule number 7. After walking out of Section B, you will notice a strange temperature change and lighting change. The time will have jumped to 2 a.m. after crossing. Do not panic and please do not answer your phone. Your phone will be ringing constantly. As soon as it starts ringing, you will stand still and not move until it stops. It will be calls from your mother, father, siblings, girlfriend, boyfriend, anyone you can think of. You must not answer these calls. It is not actually them calling. It is in fact the man that you saw earlier, the one with no facial features. He is trying to lure you back to the office. You must stay away from that office until I tell you to go back. Your phone will stop ringing after about a half hour, which leaves you at around 2:30 a.m. You can continue on at this point. Rule number 8. You will notice another time jump. This one, 2 more hours from 2:30 to 4:30. If the time still stays at 2:30 after the call stops, you're in trouble. Unfortunately, there is nothing you can do here. You messed up at a step at some point if you end up here. You can finally finish your inspection of Section C. You must be prepared for a woman covered in blood to run up to you begging for help. She will be asking you where her baby is and if you can come fast to help her. Do not be startled, no matter how loud she yells. Tell her you will meet her outside the cemetery in 10 minutes, for her to wait there. She will run off in the opposite direction, and that's how you know you succeeded. There will be a lot of towels and rags all over the ground covered in blood around Section C. This is the only maintenance you'll have to do. Just pick them up and dispose of them in the waste bin closest to you. Rule number 9. After completing this final task, you must run back to your office. Do not look anywhere but ahead of you. You will see figures everywhere. You will hear your name being called from voices that you think you recognize, but just keep running. Once you reach the office, you will see the faceless man leaving the office building. It should be 5 a.m. at this point. He will stop you and either say, "Good work," and nod at you, and you will slowly walk into the office and close the door. For the remainder of the shift, you can check the camera, sit down, and go on with your shift until I come inside to start mine. Or he would say, "Come with me." If he says, "Come with me," you will run and lock yourself in the office. Do not fall for his calm, monotone voice. He is anything but calm if you mess up. Do not let him in, and wait for him to stop banging on the door. Once the banging stops, cover your eyes for the last hour of your shift. Don't look around until you hear 3 knocks on the door. This will be me to relieve you of your shift. You won't be called in for a few weeks to come to terms with what you have seen, and you will be paid a handsome amount of money for your duties. Now that you have listened to the rules as well, I hope you can understand my initial suspicion and why I was so baffled. I thought this was a joke until I finished my shift. After my boss left at 9:30, I decided I was going to just follow the rules given to me, to humble him and be a good sport of the prank. I didn't check the cameras and I headed out the door. After going outside, the brisk fall air hit me as I saw a tall man walking up to me. I looked at him and he was actually faceless. It looked so real it kind of gave me the creeps. I almost forgot to tell him, "Good evening." He looked at me, well, I think he did, and continued on through the door. I shivered a little as I headed on straight to Section A. I arrived at the entrance and I searched for James R. Hackney's grave, a grave that I always saw, as it was the biggest one there. To my disbelief, it was actually being dug up. I felt sick to my stomach that they would go this far to scare me, so I hurried past the grave as a wave of uneasiness came over me. This can't be real, I reassured myself as I headed across the bridge to Section B. I scanned for the oak tree, and when I finally found out, I noticed the figures my boss warned me about. I instantly spotted the one with the top hat. I unsteadily scurried over to him and asked him, "Am I clear?" No answer. As I stood there, waiting for an answer that never came, I decided to look away from the man and peek over to Section B, because surely the pranksters wanted me to look, since they had warned me against it. I froze and felt pins and needles in my hands as I saw myself standing there in the distance. At least what looked like me, except I was taller and covered in blood. As the figure that presumably was me stared back, it let out a screech and started running towards me. I was startled and absolutely mortified by this, and I turned around to run. I looked back, and as it reached its arms out, it completely vanished. As soon as it had vanished, I heard a voice from within my head say, "Continue." At this point, I had a million thoughts running through my head as I started to realize whatever was happening was somehow impossibly real, and I felt my mind switch from confused to defensive. I inspected the area until 10 p.m., constantly looking over my shoulder. I checked my phone and saw it was time to move to Section 3. I felt exactly what I was told, a temperature change, and saw the surroundings get just a little bit darker. It was noticeably colder. No way, I told myself as I reached for my phone, which displayed 2 a.m. Before I could form another thought, my phone rang right on cue and stopped dead in my tracks. Dad. The phone displayed. I stared back at my phone as I looked at those 3 letters. I never knew my dad, and I definitely never had saved him in my phone. I felt a tear form in my eye because this was a very sensitive topic to me. I let it ring as I got lost in a trance of thinking about how on earth any of this was even possible. The ringing finally stopped and I let out a sigh of relief. I remembered the next rule about the time and I opened my phone again. 2:30. I kept moving on and with some stray tears in my eyes, watched my phone turn from 2:30 to 4:30. This was a relief to me because now that I knew this was somehow real, I realized that I had done all the steps right to this so far. As I started inspecting Section 3 with cold fingers and numb toes, I heard screaming. Naturally, this scared the heck out of me, and I jumped out of my shoes. I snapped my head around to a blood-covered woman screaming, "My baby! I can't find my baby!" I told her after a bit of hesitation that I would meet her at the entrance of the cemetery in 10 minutes. She nodded and ran off, and I noticed a ton of blood-covered rags all over the ground. Shaken up by her screams, I slowly picked up the rags and threw them out. I looked around and ran back to my office. The whole run, I didn't see anyone and didn't hear anything, which was weird because my boss said otherwise. I'll count my blessings here though, and find myself in front of the office finally. The man was leaving. This time I looked at him in complete terror as he turned my way and said, "Come with me." I wasted no time running past him, into the office and slamming the door behind me. "What did I mess up?" I yelled over the sound of banging on the door as I pulled a jacket over my head. I shivered in fear for the entire hour until I heard 3 knocks on the door. I shot up, threw the door open and yelled, "What did you just put me through?" I was mad, although relieved to see him, who looked a lot more colorful and lifelike than he was in the past. He looked at me and smiled at me and said, "Go home, kid, and get some sleep." I yelled back, "No, I want answers. You just can't tell me to go after the night I just had." He looked at me and said, "You took care of my cemetery, kid. I thank you for that." He held out his hand for a handshake. "The name's James Ryan Hackney, and I've been dead for 200 years. Every Halloween, I leave the cemetery and recharge so my physical body doesn't perish. You covered me last night, and I thank you for that." It didn't take me long to recognize his name as the same on the gravestone that was dug up. I stared back at him, mouth wide open, speechless. I walked out of that door, packed my house up, and never came back to this town again. It started as a joke, an impossible dare, that my friend nonetheless boldly accepted, as if he could actually eat 10 chicken sandwiches without throwing up in the span of 5 minutes. These weren't your manageable, run-of-the-mill chicken sandwiches. These were big boys, plump, juicy patties topped with thick cuts of cheddar cheese, blanketed by fresh sheets of lettuce and fat slabs of tomato, barely stuffed between 2 mighty buns. Just one would fill you up. 2 would certainly see you in comatose. And my friend, never one to back down from a challenge, accepted a truly Herculean challenge that had been made an obvious jest, to eat 10 of these titan-sustaining stacks of meat, cheese, veggies, and bread. While on our way to the restaurant, all I had said was, "God, I'm so hungry, I could eat 10 of these things." And to this, my friend had responded, "You can barely finish 1. I could eat 10 if I were hungry enough." And from there, the usual nah-ahs and yah-ahs were spoken, and the challenge was unexpectedly legitimized and accepted. As one might guess, these sandwiches were not cheap. So, I offered only to pay for them if he ate them all. He accepted these terms and purchased them himself. We took the sagging bag back to his apartment, laid these sandwiches onto the coffee table before his couch, and with only a glass of water to aid him, his choice, he went to work, devouring them with a speed and ferocity I hadn't ever before seen him exhibit. In just 2 minutes, 4 patties were gone, and by the next minute he had reached 6. 30 seconds after the 4th minute, with only 30 seconds left, he bit into the 9th patty. It was beyond impressive. It was incredible. He had done what I hadn't thought possible, by even the most practiced of competitive eaters. He was a ravening wolf in man's clothing, a beast with a boundless stomach, a void into which the cooked and circular-shaped meat of chickens were cast without care. Awe and fear both came to me, beholding this amazing display of gluttony. As the last few seconds ticked down, I withdrew my wallet, ready to adhere to the terms of the deal and offer him the money it had cost to purchase the chicken. I even pulled out a few extra dollars, deeming the feat worthy of a tip. When the timer buzzed, I patted him on the back and extended the money towards him. But what I hadn't initially noticed was that he hadn't moved in the last few seconds. And then, leaning forward a bit to get a better look at his face, I saw that he hadn't actually finished the final sandwich. 3/4 of the patty were still visible, crammed into his mouth, hideously expanding his cheeks. I rejoiced, now recognizing the reality of these circumstances, thinking that I had won, that he just hadn't been able to finish in time. I didn't realize the truth of the matter until after I had finished my celebratory dance at the end of it. I had nudged him with my elbow, and he fell over, the chicken patty still in his mouth. His eyes were wide, yet plainly unseeing, and his hands were clenched and rigid. A rivulet of drool cascaded down his chin, the culmination of these observations being that he was dead. His family wanted nothing to do with me after the funeral. I had barely been allowed to attend. His father, with whom I had grown quite close, invited me only on the condition that I say nothing and leave once the coffin had been lowered. Brett had been my friend since childhood, but considering these circumstances, I understood the harsh restrictions of attendance. The days went by and the thought of eating chicken, or really eating in general, became a repellent one. In one episode of extreme regret and shame, I even considered going vegan, but I quickly came to my senses and decided that a better way to honor Brett's memory would be to use the money that I would have paid him to purchase food for people who needed it. People who hadn't the financial luxury to buy 10 $5 sandwiches for a silly dare. I went around my city, offering meals to those I could find that appeared in desperate need of one. I set out thinking the experience would be simple enough, but was surprised by the hesitation with which people accepted food from a disheveled, grief-stricken man pulling up beside them on the sidewalk with a bag of food. I suppose I can understand how dubious the offer might have seemed. Once the deed was done, the $50 completely spent on what was meant to be goodwill, I returned home, exhausted, and not exactly feeling any better about what had happened. I missed Brett and hated myself for having enabled and provoked him. It was around 7 p.m. when the sun had started to sink into the horizon, when I heard the knocking. I had been sitting on my couch staring at my TV, which hadn't been turned on, when, to my left, 4 soft knocks were made upon the door. The locations of the knocks, which had clearly been at the lower end of the door, hadn't occurred to me then. I got up, went over to it, and answered it, not even bothering to use the peephole. I hadn't anticipated any danger or terror whatsoever. I had just watched the burial of my friend 4 days ago, and had subsequently performed a good deed. What karmic justice or unforeseen danger would I have to fear? I opened the door, only to face the closed door of the apartment across the hall, with no one standing before me. I peeked my head around the corner, thinking the visiting person might have wandered off, but the hall was empty, not a single person anywhere to be seen. I closed the door, thinking that I had to have just been too slow. My perception of time's passing had been somewhat distorted in my grief. Minutes would go by in what had seemed like only seconds. But then the knocks came again, and this time I noticed where they had landed on the door. I again opened it, this time looking down. I was taken aback, not by fear but by shock and remorse, seeing the partially eaten chicken patty. My immediate thought was that it had been placed there by a vengeful relative of Brett's, who wanted me to remember exactly what I had done to him by placing an object of his death at my doorstep. I shouted out a truly earnest and remorseful apology, and listened as the words of my contrition echoed on unheeded. No one called back in response, nor did they show themselves. I looked down to the patty, and something about it set my nerves on edge. The patty looked aged, as if it hadn't just recently been bought and bit into for the purpose of some sick reminder. The old golden buns were colorless and sunken. The meat, what could be seen of it, had blackened. The cheese was greener than the shriveled lettuce above it. It was a disgusting, putrescent thing, something meant for a fiery disposable, not consumption. I brought the door closer to the doorway, leaving it barely ajar, whilst keeping an eye on the patty through the slit between the door and the threshold. And in a moment of horror I am sure not one other living person had experienced, I witnessed a slimy, half-bitten piece of tomato extend from the sandwich and knock upon the door. Despite our differences in size and biological nature, I felt an indescribable fear at that moment. I quickly tried to fully close the door, but it wouldn't move an inch. I put all my weight against it, but it would not budge, held in place as if stopped by a brick. But there was no realistically immovable object at my feet, only a soggy, half-rotted sandwich. Panic drove me to throw myself at the door. I hadn't yet abandoned the sensible belief that I could overpower a half-pound object. Before I could complete the third collision, the door was flung open, striking me bodily and sending me falling onto my back. I laid there, dazed, holding on to my wounded shoulder. I heard a loathsome sound near my feet, a sort of squelching that sent shivers of disgust and fright throughout my body. I tried to sit up, but a sudden weight was placed upon my chest, pinning me to the ground. Angling my head forward, I saw that the monstrous sandwich had landed upon me. Somehow, it had not only prevented the door from closing, but thrown it open. And with a strength beyond being merely inhuman and disproportionate, but altogether unreal, it had pinned me in place. Stricken with a black, mind-crippling terror, I watched as it casually plopped from my chest to my chin. Its destination, my mouth, which I had foolishly left agape in my expression of terror. Without any intelligible offering of why it was assaulting me, or how it had gained an apparent sentience, the damnable sandwich leapt into my mouth. These subsequent feelings and emotions are hard for me to describe, because their telling requires a recollection that brings me great anxiety. The decayed yet animate chicken sandwich forced itself down my throat and into my belly, where it performed truly agonizing, nearly eviscerating activities. It felt as if I had swallowed a cluster of bombs, and rather than detonating simultaneously, they went off at intervals, prolonging the gastric torture. Concurrent with this activity was the assault of my brain with nightmarish imagery. Visions of darkness and entombment beneath the earth, dreadful sounds of weeping and vocalizations of pain and anger. A feeling of betrayal far worse than any heart-destroying poison. It was as if I were experiencing the successive emotions of one who had been wrongfully slain and buried, and yet still forced to hear the anguish of loved ones attending their burial. I wasn't sure which was worse, and still haven't concluded my mind on the matter. The physical agony of these sandwiches harrowing of my intestines, or those enraging, heartbreaking memories of another person's last moments. When the binary torture had finally ended, I was barely cognizant of myself and surroundings. The sandwich had exited, intact just as it had entered. The forces and acids of my gastrointestinal system hadn't had any effect on its physical integrity. It slid off of me, leaving a sickening trail of bile and its own foul juices. I heard the stomach-turning noises of its departure, and was then left in total silence. Without even bothering to get up and close the door, I cried myself to sleep. An event similar to this happened again the following day, and the next and the day after that. The sandwich sought me out and seized me at both my home and my place of work, always when I was alone and vulnerable. The experiences were similarly terrifying, equally debilitating. The sandwich continued to rot, becoming a completely black, sludge-leaking thing, an object of abject horror, of repulsiveness beyond measure. I stopped sleeping, stopped eating. The former only brought maddening nightmares, and the latter seemed unimaginable, given the nature of these sandwiches' entry into my body. I dreaded anything that would remind you of my daily and unavoidable interaction with the blackened patty. The idea for the relief of my distress didn't come to me until 5 days later. After having experienced 5 days of abdominal violation, I was driving home, barely cognizant of anything at all, when a banner somehow caught my eye among the illimitable vagueness of my surroundings. It was an advertisement for a sandwich. That sandwich, brought back to restaurants after supplies for it had run out several days ago. Seeing this and knowing that upon returning home, I would soon be confronted and invaded by that demonically possessed sandwich, I turned into the parking lot of the restaurant. 30 minutes later, I returned to my apartment with 10 chicken sandwiches, with a wallet $50 lighter. I laid those delicious yet deadly patties onto my kitchen table, pulled up a chair, and sat down before the still warm bounty. Before I could even remove one from its wrapper, an object crashed through a nearby window. I turned towards it dispassionately, having already expected its arrival. It sat, unmoving on the floor, although I had the impression that it was watching me, waiting for me to do the predestined deed. I turned back to the pile of sandwiches, unwrapped one, and began eating. 4 minutes later, I had consumed 9 sandwiches. My stomach had become unbelievably bloated, especially for such a short amount of time. I felt beyond sick, beyond full, a sense of monstrous, chicken-based impregnation. My hands, trembling, reached for the final sandwich. 30 seconds left on my phone's timer. But before I could grasp it, with a rapidity that hadn't surprised me at all, the decayed sandwich hopped onto the table and placed itself within my grasp. Understanding darkly what it insisted that I do, I brought it to my mouth. The taste was appalling. This time, this final time, I was forced to really taste it, to really eat it as if it were any other sandwich. This was my penance. The former 9 sandwiches were merely a ceremonial preamble. I chewed, swallowed, and sat there while my body worked exhaustively to digest the indigestible artifact of gluttony. Under normal circumstances, any other person would have died doing what I did. I think that I was only allowed to live so that I could remember the experience and learn from it. I still suffered under a debilitating sickness for days after that final consumption. I didn't get off easily. To call it food poisoning would be a grave understatement. I couldn't move, could barely think, and any hints of food, smells from outside, sights on TV, only prolonged the sickness, exacerbated the lingering horror. I regret my actions. I accept absolute guilt without protest. I had been allowed to live, maybe not just so that I could learn and grow as a person, but perhaps out of last-minute kindness, by a friend who has, in whatever way that matters, achieved the vengeance he desired. They say that everyone in Malice is born with a distinct color. A color that defines the house they live in, the work they do, and the friends they have. There are exactly 3 of them. It's not the color of your hair, your eyes, or your skin, but a particular spot behind your left hand's thumb. It could be ruby, blue, or green. The birth of a child is celebrated highly in Malice. The parents of the new little creature brought to this world are gifted with baskets and presents and many friendly handwritten cards. The mayor himself is present at every birth, dressed up all formally and nice. Of course, the task is quite easy as our town is rather small. Nobody even cares about the gender of the child. All we worry about is figuring out the color on its thumb. We all act surprised and a little shocked when finding out if the child is a ruby, a blue, or a green. Though in reality, it is all just for show. The child is born to a family of a distinct color, of course, and so their color will usually be the same as the one of their parents and siblings. It is tradition, however, that the mayor himself announces the color of the new child. That's how it has always been, and the people here curiously await his call every time. Right after birth, even before the father gets to see his kin. It is of utter importance to be fast. That's what my mother told me. The color you see doesn't stay forever. A day would be the outer maximum. You need to be sure of the color there and then to ensure that the child fits its environment. Or else. I wondered back then, but never quite got the right answer. Now the color coding is an old tradition, of course, and naturally, we have embedded into current times, though the cultural aspects are still quite present, or at least parts of them. For starters, I am the child of a proud Ruby family. The bricks of our house are rusty red. Every year for my birthday, Mom bakes a delicious red velvet cake. And Dad even says that our blood is ruby while the other blood is tainted. I happen to have red hair as well, although that is just a coincidence, even if it's just a lucky one. Both of my parents are blonde. Mom dyed her hair a few times, but it's not quite the same. Not that the color of one's hair should matter. We live a harmonic life. It's all quite sheltered. We're a close-knit community, and while we are coded in different colors, we still get along nicely with everyone. At my school, there are kids of all groups. We do assignments together at times or sit together during lunch. My close friends happen to be Ruby as well, but of course, that is not a requirement. I went to preschool in a neighborhood predominated by Ruby families, and so naturally, the first friends I made were Ruby, just like me. We didn't bond over color, but over toys and games and pranks that we played. When I got to elementary school, I had a few blue friends, but they usually stayed in their groups as well. Just how it naturally flows. I don't despise anyone. Everyone in town is rather nice anyway. Well, that is not entirely true. While my parents always taught me to be kind and open-minded, there is one particular family that they warned me about when I was little. Now, the paranoia is ingrained into my brain, and unfortunately, it swayed over to other members just a tiny bit. I try not to generalize, but sometimes it's hard. When I first saw the house that my parents warned me about, I was more astonished than scared. It was placed in a green neighborhood, just at the border to a blue one. I only walked past it by accident on the way home from school. Usually, I walked a different route, but I had been lost in my thoughts, and before I knew it, I was looking at the house that wasn't exactly like the others. Now, I'm not entirely sure about the color of the building itself, but it surely looked green with all the ivy covering it from top to bottom. It took me a second look to even recognize the forest green door in between. There was more to it than simply strange looks too. When I walked by the house, it radiated a smell. One that is not simple to describe, but the association in mind made it feel like belonging. It reminded me of the smell of fresh sheets that get you comfortable in with a new set of pajamas after a warm shower. It felt both like nature and home. Despite the cold of November, I stood still on the sidewalk, not able to keep my eyes off of it. I'm not even sure how long I stood there for. A part of me almost walked up to the door. It was almost as if something inside of it was calling me, trying to welcome me. And that's when I noticed that there was something behind the fogged up window, and I heard the noise of something distant but shrill. I saw fingers with sharp nails scratching the window. At first, I thought that this family might have a dog. Curiously, I walked a step closer, only to realize that the eyes of the creature were not friendly. They were red and dark with many bags underneath. As they met mine, the face got even closer to the window, pressing their forehead against it while mouthing something I couldn't understand. When I impulsively took a step back, the whispers became a loud scream. "What are you doing here, child? Go home!" At first, I thought it was coming from the house, but when I turned around, I realized that an older gentleman was shouting at me. He was dressed in a blue raincoat, and while his mouth was formed into a smile, his eyes were showing a deep terror. I started running, and I didn't stop until I reached my rusty red home. I realized just in time that whatever lived in there wasn't trying to welcome me. It wanted to lure me in. At first, I wasn't sure whether to tell my parents what I had witnessed. They were quite protective over me. I was their miracle, as Dad liked to say. You see, my parents tried to have children for a very long time before they finally had me. Dad told me how Mom cried the entire first week after I was born, because she couldn't believe how lucky she was to finally hold me in her arms. They loved me and proved it each day, which is why I knew they would freak out. Both of my parents were more than fond of our beautiful community, and they wouldn't like it if they knew that something here had scared me. Little did I know that they would be the ones enhancing my fear. "Do not ever go near that house again," my dad said in a stern voice. "They are not like us. They shouldn't even be here, but we have to accept everyone, you know. It doesn't mean you need to interact with them. They are not right," my mother added with a little more compassion. "What do you mean they're not right?" I asked. My parents exchanged a glance. "You know how everyone in Malice is gifted with a special color? We do that because the old traditions tell us to. With the right color in your mind, you will live a healthy and prosperous life. That's why our crop is always exquisite. Why we never get sick but instead grow unusually old. We are lucky because we follow the rituals. Unfortunately, there are some who naturally feel drawn to chaos and pain, and they want to bring it upon all of us." "What chaos?" I asked. "They want to spill red. The red that is inside of us," Mother responded. My heart started beating faster. None of what my parents were telling me matched the image I had of our surroundings. I had never known fear in my life. I was happy. I had many friends. It got me quite angry hearing that some people wanted to change that for no reason but pettiness. "Why can't we remove them from town?" I asked. My parents laughed in response. "That would be easy, wouldn't it? Though we can't force anyone to leave. They need to do it on their own." I had to promise my parents to never walk by that street again, but of course, I couldn't keep my promise. I was far too curious. While a part of me was frightened, another told me that it was merely a house. The following day after school, I told my friends that I had to run errands for my parents. As they walked back the Ruby Road, I tried to find my way back to the Ivy house. It wasn't hard to find, even though it looked a lot different from what I saw the day before. The house was drenched in blood. It was coming from the windows and dropping down to the green grass, big drops of blood. Of course, it could have been regular paint, but at that moment, it didn't even matter. Whatever it was, it appeared to be a sign. I was ready to make my way home. acting like I hadn't seen anything when I heard a voice. It was quiet, just a whisper, and it sounded like a child. "Come in." I looked around, but I was the only other person on the street. I took a small step closer towards the house, and there it was again. "Come to me." And that's when I stepped back and started running again. My parents were right. There was something awfully wrong with that house and the people living inside. They were trying to create chaos, and were succeeding too. I didn't think about the house on the green street a lot more after that. I always made sure not to cross it, especially not on my own. As I grew older and got my own driver's license, there was no need to take the shortcut again. Of course, I wasn't as scared as I was back then, but I figured it was better to be safe than sorry. I did spend more time in the blue neighborhood, however. As I got to high school, I realized that you don't need to be friends with someone simply because you grew up in these same surroundings. My new friends mostly worked helping their parents in the mines or in the factories, while I was usually helping out at the ice cream store, but we would meet up after work to do more relaxing stuff. Whenever I invited them to my home, my parents were super friendly. They were smiling and telling them nice things about their parents. They would usually let us hang out in the living room, and they would bring us snacks. I feel like my parents spent more time with me when friends were around than whenever I was alone. I lived quite content with a limited mindset, until one person came along who would change my view on the color concept of malice. Jonas. He came to the ice cream shop every day ordering a scoop of mint and 1 scoop of strawberry. A combination that sounded rather disgusting to me, but he swore that it fit perfectly. Jonas came back every other day, and shortly he became the one thing I looked forward to the most when going to work. I didn't tell my parents or friends about my new crush. Of course, they all acted very acceptingly and open-minded all the time, but I knew they would be reacting in an old-fashioned manner if they found out that Jonas was born a green baby. Honestly, after a while, it didn't even matter to me, but the more that we hung out, the more he made it apparent that we shouldn't tell anyone just now. It's our secret for now. Back then, I thought that was romantic. We were from the same small town, but still from different worlds. "What about your family? What are they like?" I once asked him. "Well, I don't have any siblings, but my parents are very loving. They don't interact much with others here, though." "Why not?" He laughed. "Well, because they're not as appreciated as yours." Even though he was laughing, I could sense a bitterness in his tone. As a child, I was unaware of it, but by now, it was more than apparent to me that the colors in our town meant far more than what kind of neighborhood you lived in. It was a symbol of status. Red families had more money, lived longer on average, and received a better education. Blue families were usually somewhere in the middle, and the green ones were the worst off. They didn't get great jobs, had the worst neighborhoods, and hardly any chance to get out of it. The reds and blues didn't interact with them much, separating the people even more. Jonas taught me all about that. Sometimes I almost felt like he resented me for the privilege I was born into, though he never showed it. He asked about my day, asked about my parents. He wanted to know how they treated me, what work they did, and everything else. He was way interested in my life, but never shared much of his. I was wearing the biggest rose-colored glasses that you could imagine. In my eyes, everything was right about him. I loved his blonde hair that would get even brighter in the sun. I loved his kind smile, but mostly, I loved the way that he smelled. He smelled just like home. The glasses only fell off when I came home one afternoon to be greeted by a present in my bed. It was a flower bouquet. There were roses and tulips, but something else. Something that looked very familiar. Ivy. That's when it clicked. When I realized that it wasn't a coincidence that Jonas had visited me in the ice cream shop. He had been targeting me. It started all the way back then when I walked past that house, but I simply didn't understand why. Whatever was going on is not right. I knew for a fact that my parents didn't let him inside, which meant that he had broken in to leave the flowers on my bed. Until this point, I thought I knew Jonas well, but in that moment, it all shattered. I ran down the stairs to grab my phone, but I couldn't find it. When I heard the noises from the garden and saw my mother's blonde hair in between the bushes, I felt intense relief. Mom was out there often. She loved planting flowers. It was her most favorite thing to do. She wouldn't even let me help her. Quickly, I opened the door and I ran outside. Mom. Hey, love. When the figure moved up, I realized that it hadn't been my mother's hair. It was Jonas, knee-deep inside my mom's flower bed. Did you like your death flowers? He laughed. I took a step back and got ready to run, but Jonas had already gotten up from the dirt. You can leave in a sec. I just want you to see this first. There was something strangely calm about his voice. It didn't match the atmosphere at all. What are you doing? I said while trying to sound confident. He had played with my head and I was fuming. I figured it out. I figured it all out. What are you talking about? You need to get out of here. He just laughed, his eyes radiating malice. Don't you understand? You don't belong here. You never have. Yona. He got up from the dirt. His hands were shaking as he towered over me, but suddenly he didn't look mad anymore. There were tears in his eyes. I knew it. They killed them all. Who? I murmured while taking another step back. I had to get away from here quickly. He waved me over. Just have one quick glance, okay? He didn't have any weapons. He was digging in the dirt with his hands. I knew my dad would be back home soon. I just needed to stall some time. I slowly moved towards the destroyed flower bed. Jonas was pointing at something deep underneath the dirt and flowers that he had spread all over. They looked like tiny coffins. What's that? Jonas looked at me with a sad smile. My dead siblings. I'm not sure what happened next. Jonas came close too fast, and before I knew it, everything turned dark. I woke up in a dark room. I was lying in bed, but I wasn't alone. Someone was cradling me. I felt a dry hand move up and down my cheek. I tried to move, but my body was too stiff. I tried to scream, but before any words came out, the person started whispering. Shh, it's okay. You're home now. My eyes were heavy, but as they adjusted, I saw the person. It was an older woman. Jonas was there as well, holding my hand. I wanted to crush his hand and his skull next. He had not only betrayed me, he had kidnapped me, took me from my safe home, from my family. But that was before I realized that I was the one that had taken his life. Or saved it, depending on how you like to interpret it. The woman grazed my face and my hair. Her eyes looked just like mine, and in between the gray strains, I could identify a few red ones. Oh, I'm sorry if my appearance scares you. I haven't been able to leave the house much, you see, she said with a sad smile. As it turns out, the color behind the thumb of a child doesn't always depend on their family. The privilege we were born into was entirely random. My so-called Ruby parents were trying to have a child that would fit their kind, but only managed to have babies that were not the right color. Before it was even announced, they made them disappear underneath the dirt. With the prestige my parents had in town, they could do whatever they wanted. You and I, Jonas spoke. We were born on the very same day, in the very same hospital, only minutes apart. You were born red, and I was born green, to families whose color we didn't match. Jonas was supposed to die, just like all the other kids my parents had before. But when they saw my ruby red thumb and the little strands of red hair, they knew they wanted me and they would do anything to get me. It was perfect. We were born at the same time and no one would ever know. My real parents didn't have much of a choice. Nobody in this town would help them. They didn't have the money or power to fight the Ruby families. The only thing they could do at this point was to save the life of an innocent boy who otherwise would have been sacrificed. All their life, they were threatened. My fake family did whatever they could to make sure they stayed far away from me, sending them blood as a threat, slowly poisoning them and making sure all the town was against them. For years, they were driven by fear. But not anymore. It was time this concept of color ended. And we would start by turning their ruby red house into burning red flames. Now, my friend Jasper and I enjoy hunting. We head into the wilderness every chance that we can get, on weekends mostly. He's the talkative one. I guess that makes sense because he's a car salesman. I'm a school teacher, so we usually have a lot to talk about. The differences keep things interesting. The wooded area around my town is pretty extensive. It's riddled with little caves, most of them fairly small. There are so many trees it's easy to get disoriented, or accidentally shoot someone. Jasper's still sore about the incident from a few years back. But what we're really reeling from is our most recent trip. Jasper seems excited, said he had a good feeling about this weekend. Of course, he sold a few cars that week, so he couldn't help but be in a good mood. We took off for the woods that Friday, both eager to get away from our quaint suburban lives. On the drive out of town, Jasper tapped me on the shoulder. I got a good feeling about this weekend, Miles. I think I might achieve the much coveted threefer. What do you think? Or are we going to come out of the woods soaked and empty-handed? Jasper always looked to me for a reality check before we went hunting. I just shook my head. I don't know, Jasper. Actually, I'm not getting a good reading either way. Neutral. Neutral, huh? Maybe I'll bag $1 and then half of another one. Not bad, I can live with that. Mainly it's about getting away, you know that. Cindy and I are having problems. You two will work things out, you always do, I replied, forcing my tone to be light. I hoped my reading of the situation was wrong, and that Jasper would achieve this threefer. Part of me wondered how he could talk like that and somehow manage to get himself a wife, but I never gave my curiosity a voice. From there, the drive wasn't very long. Well, just long enough that we had the impression we were far away from the pressure of our humdrum lives, like always. Out here in the wilderness, I had a new appreciation for Jasper's moral internal compass. He didn't care about the moral implications of hunting. He just wanted to enjoy the weekend. I did too. Sarah and I were doing just fine. Well, we would be doing better if James, our son, wasn't having behavioral problems. He had always come back late, and Sarah expressed concern many times over the kind of friends he spent time with. I earned a reprimand from her about going on this trip. She said that James was reacting to me being gone all the time, which wasn't fair, I retorted. Sure, I went hunting with Jasper on many weekends, but not all of them. And every time I tried to spend a day with James, he acted embarrassed by me. Honestly, these hunting trips are the only thing keeping me sane. Jasper didn't talk that much about his wife either, but from what he allowed himself to say, his home life wasn't very pleasant. And I knew from experience that underneath Jasper's supposedly good moods lurked a current of discontent. He seemed so excited for this weekend, which told me something was wrong. Everything proceeded like usual. We drove to our preferred camping spot, got out our gear, and then we set everything up. There wouldn't be much hunting for the rest of the day because there wasn't much of it left. Jasper could gather firewood like nobody's business, so I fished out a can of beans from the backpack of snacks that we brought with us. It was tradition. The woods had a creepy feel as evening approached. I found Jasper's talk about the much coveted 3 for less and less soothing as we ate our beans, which cooked slowly over the crackling fire. Jasper nodded off in his sleeping bag around 9:45. I watched as the ghostly rays of moonlight shone through the branches. I wasn't ready to go to sleep right at that moment, so I opened the backpack of snacks James was responsible for and I rooted through it. My hand brushed against something metal. I hastily pulled it out. "What the?" I whispered, and Jasper muttered something, turning over in his sleeping bag. I took the trinket close to the fire so I could see it more clearly. Bright orange flame reflected off the glossy black amulet, which had a silver skull placed in the middle. I wondered if this belonged to my son James, as he had a gothic sensibility about him. James, what am I going to do with you?" I asked the woods. The impatient hooting of an owl answered back. I went back to my sleeping bag, bringing out a mystery book that I always took with me on trips. Usually, I could polish off a mystery in a few weeks, as I saved them specifically for these trips. I must have nodded off while reading, because I was startled awake by Jasper's voice. He said something about seeing the biggest buck in his whole life. "Grab your rifle," he yelled back at me, and I struggled out of my sleeping bag and I grabbed the rifle, the backpack too. I never went into the woods without that. When I was younger, out hunting with Dad, I got lost in the woods for hours. The fear of starving to death from a food shortage or dehydration had been seared into my brain. I followed Jasper's hulk of a frame, close enough anyway, and seemed to lose him at the foot of a stream. Putting the rifle strap over my shoulder, I gazed around and then fished for the flashlight of my backpack. Once I found it, I shone it in every direction until I spotted the jagged mouth of a cave in the center of a large hill. I would have to climb the sides of the stream about 30 feet to reach it, and I wasn't even sure that I would fit through. Well, I did manage to squirm my way into the cave, the smell of bat droppings instantly reaching my nostrils. I picked up the flashlight which had fallen from my hand as I made my way past the opening. "James?" I whispered, not wanting to disturb the bats too much. I heard a shout, not a direct response to what I said necessarily, and I did my best to run towards the sound. The cave tunnel twisted and turned, narrowing enough that it stimulated my claustrophobia. The smell of bat droppings only increased as I went deeper into the cave. Eventually, I glimpsed an opening several feet ahead, this one a bit smaller than the entrance, and this exit looked almost key-shaped. There was no sign of Jasper, so I attempted to climb through the exit. My foot became stuck on some jagged rock. Just as I was able to free it, I tumbled out and felt my phone vibrating in my pants pocket. I lay, stunned on the ground for a minute, and then sat up. I could barely see 2 feet in front of me because the flashlight had fallen in front of me and turned to the side. "Dang, Miles, where the heck are we? You okay?" I heard the sound of Jasper's voice, uncharacteristically thin as a random wind began to blow. "Yeah, I'm alright. Ankle hurts a bit, but I don't think it's sprained." I reached into my pocket and pulled out my cell phone. There was a text from Sarah, except it looked like it had been cut off. There's something wrong with Both Jasper and James started with J, so I wasn't quite sure who she was referring to. Most likely, since she really talked to Jasper aside from random small talk before our trips. This meant James. But what could possibly be wrong with him? I sent a text back, wondering if it would go through all the way in the middle of nowhere, but I received a partial text, so maybe something would go through. I stared in front of me, completely confused as the cave opening I emerged from apparently didn't exist anymore. For a few more minutes, I stared and tried to comprehend my situation. Once I recovered my wits, I went to where Jasper stood at the edge of a crescent of trees. He seemed to be staring blankly off into the distance. And now see where the ground takes a tip next to those large rocks. I think we've been there before. Let's head in that direction, Jasper said. The thing was, Jasper had significant charisma but a poor sense of direction. I'd follow him to hell and back, and he would still probably convince me he made the right decision. So we headed into the crescent of trees, populated by all sorts of woodland critters. My anxiety started to increase as we seemed to be going in circles, and I kept checking my watch. The sun should have risen already, Jasper muttered. More hours passed. Okay, something's messed up. It says 10:30 a.m. on my watch and it still looks like midnight. Jasper continued. I nodded. I'm starting to get a little spooked, honestly, I said. Where the heck are we? Jasper didn't answer. We walked in silence for a long time. Days. Without the sun, seconds, minutes, hours. Time itself became irrelevant. I began to walk ahead of Jasper, scanning the environment for any signs of familiarity with the campsite, but I didn't find any. Instead, I stopped just short of a clearing, watching as a deer tore into the bloodied carcass of a squirrel. The deer had fangs, a cluster of murky eyes and short, black antlers that were bent at odd angles. I held up a hand to Jasper. He halted, following my gaze. The clouded eyes of the deer were fixed in us now, aware of our presence as it looked as if it was sucking the blood from the squirrel's tiny head. I watched in horror as it continued the process, almost daring me to intervene with its hateful stare. All of a sudden, it lunged at us, all eyes focused on me. Jasper tried to fire his rifle at the thing, but it didn't work. Thinking furiously, I took the amulet from my pocket and held it in front of me. The beast stopped in its tracks, growling, the squirrel's blood dripping from its serrated teeth. It backed away, its hooves oddly silent against the dead leaves. Growling a few more times, it turned in the opposite direction and fled into the woods. Jasper asked if I was okay, and I stood up shakily, responding as best I could. We wandered the wilderness some more. Jasper had gone up ahead, so by the time that I caught up to him, he was next to a pond filled with black ooze. I saw him talking to a man in black robes. He had a scar on his left cheek and seemed very familiar. One of the man's eyes looked completely mangled, and it took me a moment to realize that he had a paleness of a corpse. As I approached a few more feet, his expression became more alert and he took off, fleeing with the grace of a woodland creature. Jasper turned to face me. Miles, I know the way out of here. The man in the robes told me, but I have a confession to make. That amulet you found in your backpack, it's mine. Except until now, I didn't know who put it there. Who put it there? I asked, a tone flat, anger boiling underneath. Your son. See, how he just explained it to me is that I told him about my lucky talisman, the amulet. I use it when I need a lucky week. It doesn't work all the times, but sometimes. I mean, I figured it was mostly superstition at work. I guess I was wrong. Anyway, he must have stolen it from me and placed it in your backpack. Not sure how that translated into us finding ourselves here. Look, Miles, James said that he just wanted to spend time with you, and this was the only way. He realized that he went too far and he showed me the way out. I didn't say anything after that. Knowing James as I knew him, I wasn't sure if I bought that. According to Jasper, James realized he carried things too far and appeared here to show us the way out. There is a cave not too far from the pond and we entered it, following the twisting, arduous tunnels to the exit. I was ecstatic to see the sun, especially the campsite. Everything was illuminated in the early morning light, and Jasper appeared just as thrilled as me to be back from wherever we were. We packed everything up and we began the drive home. Jasper lamented that he hadn't achieved his threefer as a clumsy attempt to return to a vague normalcy, but it didn't work. We fell silent and we didn't talk much the rest of the way. At home, after dropping Jasper off, I went inside and greeted everyone. James was cool to me, if seemingly repentant. His eyes were darting back and forth, probably wondering whether or not I would say anything. I chose not to because Sarah and James had already fought about something the week before, and they were still recovering from that. Later, James asked to see me in his room. He said he was sorry for what he did, and that he didn't mean to cause me harm or anything like that. It was just an innocent prank, he claimed, inspired by what his friend Bobby suggested. Apparently Bobby saw real power in the amulet. Jasper requested it back, of course, so I wasn't worried about him using it again. But there's something different with James now. After that initial civil conversation, I've seen troublesome changes in him. For starters, his eyes have this weird, murky tint to them like the deer in the woods. I've noticed him lying more. Little things. Still, before his usage of the amulet, he was almost pathologically honest. I've noticed James muttering to himself, not when Sarah's around. He's clever enough. And those mutterings mentioned something about the returning to the woods, and that this wasn't meant to happen. I don't know. James feels malicious to me now, where he didn't before, and I'm not sure what to do. The cold October air filled my lungs as I brushed past the bushes to either side. I grunted when a twig I had just pushed aside snapped back and whipped me in the face. "Wait!" Dylan called out to me from behind, and I halted to give him and the others some time to catch up with me. "Way to leave us hanging back there," he commented upon arriving at my side. Jack followed close behind, panting a little, and at last Emily joined us as well. I looked around at each of their faces, each one having grown familiar and dear to me in the past 20 years the four of us had known each other. I could still remember what they used to look like as children, but the older we had gotten, the further we had grown apart. Time had separated us. Well, maybe not all of us. I smiled at Jack as he shuffled closer to me and reached out to grab my hand. As our fingers intertwined, the well-known feeling of his ring against my skin reminded me of our engagement. Dating someone you have known all your life is weird. I always had a feeling he saw me as more than just a friend, but I never wanted to take any risks of destroying an emotional bond. And then one day, Jack came to my place unannounced to profess his undying love for me or something. The poor guy was completely hammered. I told him that he could stay the night and we would talk things out the following day. I could hardly deny that I had started developing feelings for him at that point. So we finally decided we would give it a shot and start testing the waters. Our testing the waters soon developed into a pretty serious relationship. And then about 5 months ago, Jack proposed to me after having dated for several years. And we're going to get married in 8 months, the prospect of which made my heart flutter with joy. Even in that remote forest the four of us had gotten together to go camping in. Dylan raised an eyebrow at us and made some snide remark about saving some of the cuddling for our honeymoon. A statement that made both of us roll our eyes. Emily laughed at Dylan and told him he was just jealous because his relationship wasn't making any progress, and he didn't have the balls to pop the question. We joked around and playfully mocked each other before proceeding into the woods on the lookout for a place to set up camp. When we finally found a nice little clearing, we unpacked our stuff, and while the guys set up the tent, Emily and I went to gather some twigs and dry leaves we would use to make a campfire. We threw it all on a big heap, placed stones around it, and lit it on a fire, just like we had done so many times before. "Hey, you girls got the fire ready. I'm hungry," my fiance's voice sounded from behind the tent. "You guys got the tent up yet? We can have a stack as soon as you're done," I replied. Yeah, that's gonna take a little longer, I think," Jack responded. "Dylan ain't too much of a help neither." "Oh, shut up," I could hear Dylan say. "Just do it yourself next time if you're so dang smart." Jack grunted and Emily and I exchanged knowing glances. They had always been like this, poking fun at each other at every possible opportunity. Emily and I sat down by the fire to chat a little while the boys were busy with the tent. After about half an hour, my fiance called out to us in a cheerful manner. "Hey, come on over, it's ready." It was the same tent we had always used, a large one with 3 cabins and a large entry space where one of us, usually Jack, would always have to volunteer to sleep so the rest of us could be comfortable. "Thank God I don't need to sleep on the ground anymore," he remarked as if he had read my mind. "So dang cold." He grinned at me before adding, "Remember the moment you said yes, you signed up for me getting on your nerves for the rest of your life? It's gonna get hella comfy in there with 2 people squeezed into one room." "Ooh," Emily cooed. "Don't worry. By that he means he'll just take up all the space and force me to sleep in the tiniest of corners, while snoring loud enough to keep away all the wildlife in a 10-mile radius," I explained matter-of-factly, causing Dylan and Emily to laugh out loud while Jack gave a playfully insulted snortle. We all sat down by the campfire and began roasting our food while talking some more. Emily regaled us with stories about her life with her husband, and Dylan kept boasting about the promotion he got at his job. He had taken up the role of the quiet listener, while Jack prattled away about our wedding, the location we had chosen, the suit that he was going to wear, the guest list. I shot him a quick look, reminding him not to give away the fact that we were planning on asking Emily and Dylan to be the maid of honor and best man respectively. I wanted to do that somewhere a little more formal. By the time the sun had set, we were still sat around our fireplace. Dylan had just handed out our 3rd round of beer, and Emily, who had gotten quite cheerful over the evening, suddenly suggested we play a game of truth or dare. Dylan agreed enthusiastically. Jack seemed a bit reluctant at first but nodded, and I simply shrugged. Why not? "Okay, I'll go first," Emily began. "Clover, truth or dare?" She looked at me expectantly. Dare," I replied. "Alright, climb that tree over there." "Oh, okay, lame but okay." I stood up and I walked towards the tree Emily was pointing at. I reached out for the lowest branch, pulled myself up and grabbed onto the one right above it. When I was high enough up, I swung my legs onto the first branch and slowly lowered my whole body down on it. Feeling a rush of adrenaline when I heard the wood creak under my weight, I looked up at Emily triumphantly. "There you go. My turn. Dylan." "Truth," he replied instantly. "Are you actually going to ask Jill to marry you?" Well, that got serious fast. But yeah, I do want to ask her, but I want to wait until the time is right. I don't want anyone else, but I do want it to be special. Like when she's least expecting it. When she's least expecting it, eh? My fiance chimed in. I can already see you knocking on the bathroom door while the poor girl's on the toilet. Yeah, sure, I'll marry you, sugar. Let me just pull my pants up. Emily jeered, mimicking the high-pitched voice of Dylan's girlfriend. Funny, guys, very funny. Say, Jack, how long do you have to keep Clover in your basement before Stockholm Syndrome sets in? Dylan asked with a sly grin. Jack grunted and I pretended to swing at him. Suddenly, the smile faded from Emily's face. Did you guys hear that? She asked. Hear what? I replied. I heard a branch snap, she said, turning to look around. Yeah, well, we're in the woods, so... It sounded like somebody stepped on it, though. She interrupted me. How do you know that? Dylan inquired. Will you shut up already? It just didn't sound right, okay? Quiet, Emily hissed. The four of us held our breaths. This time, we all heard it. The sound of footsteps echoed through the forest. Emily was right. Something about it sounded wrong. It was as if the forest had suddenly fallen completely silent, and there was no one but us and who or whatever had caused the noise. We exchanged concerned glances and I quietly slid off my branch and crept over to my fiancé. Dylan gestured for us to stay still. Finally, he slowly rose to his feet and, barely able to hide the nervousness in his voice, he called out, Is anybody there? Silence. The footsteps had stopped. This is freaking me out, I heard Emily whisper. Hello? Dylan called out once again. This time, however, a voice answered from among the trees. Good evening. I didn't mean to startle you. The four of us spun around to see a man standing right next to the tree that I had climbed earlier. He wore a black suit with a red tie, and as he approached, I could see that there wasn't a single mud stain on his perfectly shined dress shoes. His pant legs were uncrumpled and clean, and needless to say, he did not give the impression of a hiker. It was hard to tell how old he was. He looked older, but his skin did not show a single wrinkle. It's hard to describe, but somehow, the man managed to make me feel both unnerved and extremely repelled at the mere sight of him. May I join you? He asked in the same monotone voice, and without waiting for a reply, he sat down on the ground right next to me. What are you doing here? I stammered. Oh, I expected something like, who are you? But okay, fair enough. The hint of a smile grazed his thin lips, and as he gave me a small wink, I simply want to participate in your game. Truth or dare amongst friends is always interesting. Don't worry, I won't stay the night, he chuckled. By the way, that's a nice tent you got there. Thanks, Dylan offered. The stranger smiled once again. Now, why don't you go on? Whose turn was it? Dylan, right? Well then, go ahead. Dylan just stared at the man in utter confusion. I bit my lip. How had he known his name? Can't come up with something? I'll help you out. The stranger leaned back and looked up at the stars twinkling through the treetops before turning to face my fiancé. Jack, truth or dare? Listen, I don't know who you are, but I would rather you leave, Jack said in a low, cold voice as he pulled me in a little closer. Closing my fingers around his, I could feel them trembling. He did a good job masking his fear. The stranger chuckled and shook his head. Oh, come on now, Jackie. There's no need to be so rude. I just want to have a little fun with you guys. Playing a game won't hurt, will it? Side glancing at Jack's arm around my shoulders, he added, And I'm not going to steal your girl either. Relax. So, truth or dare? Jack scowled at him. Truth, he replied under his breath. Did Clover ever find out about the pictures? The man asked without even a hint of hesitation. Jack instantly turned pale and his hand slowly slid off my shoulder. I looked at him in confusion. He gave no answer, just stared at the strange man, a mixture of incredulousness and shock in his face. What pictures? He uttered. The newcomer laughed. No good one, Jack. But jokes aside, I guess that means you never told her. My fiancé didn't respond. Figured as much. It's probably better that way. The stranger continued. I doubt Sweet Clover would be quite as fond of you if she knew. By the way, congratulations and my best wishes for the two of you. I mean it. Then again, I kind of think that people who have decided to spend their life together should not have any secrets the other one doesn't know about. Don't you agree, Clover? Darling. He smirked at me and winked once again. That's enough. Screw off. Jack suddenly yelled at the man. His face had gone from pale to red. I shrunk back. I had never heard him scream before. The stranger, however, rolled his eyes and remained seated. Oh, Jack. It would have been better if you had just told her. She would have gladly forgiven you. You were still a pubescent, dumb boy after all. But now that you've kept it a secret from her for all these years, it makes you look horrible, you know. Like a pervert. A stalker, even. Also, I wouldn't have to do it. Shut up. Jack hissed through clenched teeth, but it almost sounded pleading. Desperate. The year is 2010 and both Clover and Jack are 15. The man began, his voice like that of a history teacher. Jack had never gotten over the crush he developed on her in his early teens, and while Clover couldn't be less interested, he is pining for her on a daily basis. Now, 15-year-old Jack's most prized possession is a camera which he starts using to at least pretend he is close to his childhood sweetheart. He sneaks up to her house at night and climbs onto the balcony. From there, he has a nice view of Clover's room, and as he soon finds out, an even nicer spot to take pictures of her body when she's asleep or changing clothing. As time progresses, he grows disgusted by his own actions and stops taking these lewd photos. However, he apparently can't bring himself to destroy them. The camera still exists, and so do the photos. He never dares to look at them again after that, so if I'm not mistaken, they're still under that same loose floorboard in his former room in his childhood home. I had listened to the story in horror. It was only when the man had stopped talking that I dared to look over at my fiancée. Jack was frozen. He had slumped over and was staring at the ever-flickering campfire with glazed eyes. Upon noticing my gaze, he turned away, avoiding to look me in the eyes. I swallowed the queasy feeling the tale had stirred in me, and asked in as gentle a voice that I could muster, "Is it true, what he says?" Jack nodded ever so slightly, and I could hear him mumble quiet words of apology. I scooched a little closer to him. "Baby, it's fine, you hear me? That was 9 years ago. It's not like you can change what happened now, and I still want to marry you. You were a kid, and to be honest, I think there are worse things a horny teenager could do. But I want you to go back to your parents' place and get rid of those pictures. We won't even have to talk about it ever again, okay?" He slowly raised his head to look up at me. "Really? You're actually letting me get away with this?" "I'll be honest, it does kind of hurt that you never told me, but I don't know. I'm crazy about you. Maybe I should be more upset, but I love you. Once we're married, we'll be facing a whole new caliber of problems, and I'm just grateful to have you here with me." "That's so sweet," twisted but sweet. The strange man's voice threw us out of our conversation and back into the reality of sitting in the middle of the woods with a person that we had never met before. See that, Dylan? That's commitment. Something you'll never quite understand. Dylan looked puzzled, but as the realization dawned on him, his heart dropped. I could see it in his eyes. The man knew something about him as well. Dear Dylan has rambled on and on to all of you about how he wants to make his current girlfriend Jill his bride, and I admit, he is quite motivated. He even bought a ring already, but for some reason he just can't bring himself to ask. Now, you'd better ignore all that crap he's been telling you about waiting for the perfect moment. The truth is much less adorable, isn't it, Dylan? The year is 2017. Dylan and Jill, or Jillian as I like to call them, had been dating for 3 years at that point. Jill is very much in love with her partner, but on his side, that feeling has started to wear off. At a party of one of his other friends Jill hasn't been invited to, he meets Rebecca. Rebecca tells him that she's 18. They hit it off right away, and Dylan is quite smitten by her. In his state of drunkenness, he doesn't even think twice about it, and the two of them excuse themselves from the party. When Dylan wakes up the next morning, he finds himself next to a younger looking girl than he remembers. Who knows if she was even of age? She could have lied to him. The guilt hits him immediately, and he flees from the scene to confess his wrongdoings to his girlfriend. Now, Jill is quite appalled by his actions, but having about the self-esteem of a face cloth and still being quite fond of Dylan, she decides not to break up with him. Ever since then, their relationship has been slowly deteriorating. Dylan, however, has realized that he does have strong feelings for Jill, and he doesn't want to lose her. He starts toying with the idea of marriage. Surely, this would rescue the rotting corpse he calls a relationship, but would Jill say yes to him after that? The question plagues him, and to this day, he remains uncertain. The stranger let out a sigh and smiled over at Dylan with a look of pity. But he never told you that, did he now? It's crazy how much you people don't know about one another, and yet you still call each other friends. Best friends, even. I don't know if that's admirable or sad. Who are you? I heard myself say. The words had just suddenly burst out of me. The man in the suit turned to face me. He looked surprised. Oh, me. I'm flattered, dear. I thought out of all the new things you will learn tonight, I would be the least interesting. But by now you probably already know who I am. Are you the devil? I couldn't believe I had actually said it. It sounded so insane, so surreal, but it felt correct. Upon mouthing my response, a slight frown crossed his face. I hate it when they call me that, he uttered. He leaned back and stared up at the sky again. No, I'm no devil by any means, but you're not wrong either. I go by many names, none of which describe me correctly. My favorite, though, the most accurate one, is Father of Lies. I'm not the guy who welcomes you into hell when you die. There isn't even anything like that. When you die, it's just over. The brain stops working. That's all. I see myself as more of an independent mind. I'm independent in a lot of aspects. Also, as you might have noticed already, I know a lot. Clover, why do you think I'm doing this? Coming up to your little group and telling you about all the mistakes you ever made. Because you get off on it, I suggested truthfully. Father of Lies smiled. As a matter of fact, I do. But I'll admit, My way of working is usually a bit different. Lovers arguing, children crying, nations fighting. That's me. That kind of stuff is always me. But once in a blue moon, when the weather's nice and the moon is up, I tend to feel a little more outgoing. Tonight's one of these occasions. I see. I felt myself suddenly becoming strangely calm. Are you going to tell some humiliating story about me now too? What? No. Let's be honest with ourselves here. No one here could care less about your little secrets. It's scandals I'm interested in. Not stuff like you getting up at night to watch these cheesy soap operas you always rant about. Or the fact that you jog over to the donut shop. You're nice, but you're boring. No offense. None taken, I murmured, confused and relieved at the same time. My hand instinctively reached up to scratch a certain spot in the back of my neck. I had bigger secrets than that, and he knew that. I was rather grateful that they would remain untold, though. Now, let's get to the real prize, shall we? Emily. Father of Lies turned to face my friend who was cowering next to Dylan, a deep scowl on her face. I was taken aback. I had never seen her look like that at anyone, ever. Emily was always so laid back. I would have expected her to be scared, but there was nothing but hatred in her gaze. Emily has told all of you about her husband, hasn't she? Well, the interesting thing is that the poor guy doesn't exist. Father of Lies began with a smug grin on his face. He's lying, Emily hissed. I'm not. But I admit I'm rather thrilled about this story. It's easily the most interesting out of these three. It's in early 2019, and our dear Emily had been seeing a gentleman named Marcus for quite a while now. The feelings that she has towards him, she describes them as love. Any sane person, however, would call it obsession. Marcus and Emily are in an official relationship, but for Emily, it isn't enough. She doesn't trust Marcus, or rather, she doesn't trust the women that interact with him. In Emily's mind, Marcus is hers and hers alone, and every single conversation he has with another female, in fact, even a simple hello, is enough to start the crazy train going. Marcus grows increasingly helpless against his girlfriend's psychological abuse. In the beginning, he used to find it cute when she got jealous, but by now, she's starting to scare him. He decides it would be best to break things off with her. Too bad that he makes that decision the very same day Emily decides she's going to propose to him. When he sits her down in their shared apartment and tells her that they need to talk, she thinks that they had the same idea. So when he tells her that it would be best if they would part ways, she goes into a frenzy. She runs into the kitchen, grabs a knife, and proceeds to stab Marcus 8 times in the chest. But poor Emily had already become so deranged that this isn't where she stops. She puts on the ring that she bought for him and calls one of her best friends, our darling Clover here, to tell her that she and Marcus were now engaged. Ever since then, Emily has pretended to have a husband. The story about the Vegas wedding, fake. All the funny and cute tales she told you about their life together, made up. Every last one of them. The fact that the three of you live so far apart from her has most certainly helped her hide it. Otherwise, you might have gotten wind of the police search after the poor guy. They never found him. Incompetent dimwits. And no, Marcus suddenly developing an aversion to social media is of course not the reason that he doesn't appear in any of her pictures anymore. To this day, he's peacefully rotting away in her freezer. By the time that he had ended his tale, we were staring at Emily in utter horror. I couldn't believe it. So this was the person that I had grown up with. A murderer. How had she even managed to set up such an elaborate facade? How had she been able to deceive us like that? When she had told me about her engagement over the phone, I had been so happy for her. I had met Marcus just once before, but I had never really had the desire to pursue a friendship with him. All the things she said, I had simply believed them. Emily slowly rose to her feet. She looked around at us and then, suddenly, she lunged at the father of lies. I let out a shriek and I could hear Jack gasp loudly. But Emily didn't get very far. She halted mid-motion, frozen with her arms outstretched and her hands grabbing at nothing. Father of lies smirked. "That was really uncalled for," he said softly. He shot me a quick glance and his smile grew even wider. "May Emily, truth or dare?" Emily opened her mouth to reply, but it was his voice that spoke. "Dare." I could see the terror in her eyes. She wasn't doing this. As I looked over at Father of Lies, his gaze seemed to be already expecting me, and we locked eyes for a brief moment. I mouthed a silent plea, begging for my former friend's life, but he merely shook his head. When he spoke up again, his voice was as cold as ice. "I dare you to plunge that stupid head of yours into the campfire." I will not describe the scene that followed. The sight of Emily's flesh melting off her skull is not one I would like to relive. Jack and Dylan's screams of horror and the crackling of the fire mixed with the muffled cries of Emily all seemed to be in the far distance. I didn't scream. I turned my head to look at Father of Lies. For some reason, I felt empty, void. I simply stared at him and the tiny smile that had formed on his thin lips. When Emily ceased to move, Jack and Dylan just sat and stared at her dead body. They seemed to be in a state of shock. Registering this, I made a mental note to suggest therapy to my fiancée on our way home. When Father of Lies got up, so did I. "Jack," he asked. "Jack, do you mind if I borrow your wife-to-be for a second?" "Jack?" No reply. "Huh," he murmured. "I guess he can't hear us." He grinned at me. "Was that really necessary?" I inquired. "I'm afraid so. Wouldn't you have done the same? Look, I didn't want to ruin your camping trip, but I was around and saw you sit there and, I'm really sorry. But she had that coming. Let's be honest here. Have you ever seen anything so disrespectful? And besides, she was a murderer." He straightened his suit. "I hate it when they're disrespectful." I just stared at him, arms crossed in front of my chest. "You didn't recognize me at first, did you?" he asked, raising an eyebrow. "Sorry, but you changed your looks. You always do. How can you expect me to just spot you immediately? I thought you were one of your brothers. I caught on when you told me about that independent stuff, though." "It's fine." He took a few steps towards me and motioned for me to turn around. I obeyed and he closed his hand around my long hair and lifted it up. He let his fingers graze these spots in the back of my neck, the spot that held his mark. "There it is," he muttered. "Nice and clear." He rubbed over it with his thumb. "You really thought I would tell them about the deal for a second back there, didn't you?" He chuckled. "Remember the promise I gave you?" I nodded. "Good. Now remember the promise you gave me." I nodded once again. "Don't worry. My heart belongs to him, but my soul will always be yours."